It was the summer of 1945. The war that had swallowed the world was gasping its final breath. The Pacific had been a battlefield of fire, fury, and unimaginable loss. Japan stood defeated, and across the islands of the Pacific, on Guam, Okinawa, and Saipan, thousands of weary, hollow-eyed Japanese soldiers were laying down their arms for the first time. The empire that had once sworn never to surrender now bowed its head before the rising sun of peace. Behind barbed wire, rows of Japanese prisoners of war sat silently, their faces etched with exhaustion and disbelief. For years, they had been told the Americans were monsters, men who burned cities, showed no mercy, and killed without compassion. But what they found in those American-run camps was something else entirely. On one quiet afternoon, under a clear Pacific sky, an American guard approached carrying a crate, its glass bottles clinking softly. The Japanese soldiers watched as the caps hissed open, releasing a sound they had never heard before. A rich, sweet aroma filled the air. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't poison. It was Coca-Cola. For the first time, men who had once faced each other through rifles and bayonets shared something human, something ordinary, and yet extraordinary. The dark liquid shimmered in the sunlight as trembling hands lifted the bottles. When the first sip touched their lips, many could not hold back their tears. In that simple act of kindness, the bitterness of war began to melt away. The Americans knew the power of morale, not just for their troops, but for humanity itself. They had fought through jungles, storms, and endless nights of uncertainty. They had seen death so often that it no longer shocked them. Yet even in victory, they did not forget what it meant to be human. When the war in the Pacific finally ended, the United States faced not only the challenge of rebuilding shattered nations, but also of restoring the broken souls of those who had once been their enemies. In prisoner of war camps across the islands, the Americans made a decision that would seem small to the world. But to those who lived through it, it became a moment of redemption. The camps were orderly, almost eerily calm. Rows of bamboo huts stretched under the vast Pacific sky. The ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and damp earth, mingling with the faint aroma of cooked rice and soap. American guards moved about with quiet efficiency. Their uniforms were worn from years of battle, their faces sunburned and tired. But their eyes, those eyes no longer carried hatred. They carried a strange mixture of fatigue and compassion. These were men who had seen too much and learned too much to hate anyone anymore. On the other side of the wire sat the Japanese prisoners, thin, stoic, and silent. Many of them still held their military posture even in captivity. They rose when called. They bowed slightly when addressed. To the Americans, they seemed like statues carved from stone, unmoving, expressionless, trapped within invisible walls of shame and disbelief. They were soldiers who had grown up believing surrender was dishonor. To be alive after defeat felt worse than death. Some had expected to be executed. Others had prepared themselves for torture or starvation. Instead, they were met with decency. And that decency was something they could not understand. At first, there was suspicion. The Americans provided food, warm, plentiful meals that tasted strange but nourishing. Rice, meat, even chocolate appeared on their trays. The prisoners would bow slightly before eating, whispering words of thanks in Japanese. But they did not trust it. Some refused to eat for days, thinking it might be a trick. But time changed things. When they saw that no one was beaten, no one humiliated, their fear began to fade into quiet confusion. Among the American guards was a young man from Kansas named Private Richard Cole. He had grown up on a farm, drinking Coca-Cola after long days in the field. For him, the drink was a symbol of everything good and familiar. The laughter of his family, the sound of a screen door creaking in summer, the cool fizz against his lips. When he was stationed at the POW camp in Saipan, he noticed something missing in the air, something that no amount of food or order could restore humanity. The Japanese prisoners were alive, yes, but they were hollow. So one day, when a supply ship arrived carrying crates of rations and beverages for the Americans, Richard had an idea so simple it almost felt foolish. He decided to share. The moment was unplanned. There was no ceremony, no speech, no instruction from command. The sun was high, and the heat was unrelenting. The guards had been unloading boxes from the truck when Richard picked up a wooden crate, the bottles clinking softly against each other. The glass was cool to the touch, droplets of condensation forming instantly in the tropical air. As he walked toward the prisoners, the other guards looked at him, puzzled. The Japanese watched in silence, unsure of what he was carrying. He stopped before the wire fence. The interpreter stood nearby, confused. Richard lifted a bottle, tapped it lightly with his finger, and smiled. "Coca-Cola," he said softly. The interpreter hesitated, then translated the words. The prisoners looked at each other, uncertain if they had heard correctly. To them, Coca-Cola was a word from another world, a world that had seemed unreachable during the long years of war. Richard twisted off the cap, and the familiar hiss of carbonation filled the air. The sound seemed to echo across the camp, small yet strangely powerful. The smell followed, a sweet, syrupy scent unlike anything they had ever known. The Japanese prisoners flinched slightly, some stepping back, others leaning forward in curiosity. The sunlight caught the liquid inside the bottle, turning it a rich, golden brown amber. For a brief moment, time seemed to stop. When Richard handed the first bottle through the fence, one of the older prisoners hesitated. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted it. The glass felt heavy, unfamiliar. The liquid inside shimmered as if it held something more than just a drink. The man looked at Richard, unsure of what was expected. Richard nodded gently. "Drink," he said. The interpreter repeated the word in Japanese. Slowly the prisoner lifted it to his lips. The taste hit him with a rush, cold, sweet, alive. It was unlike any taste he had ever known. For years, his mouth had only known the bitterness of war, canned food, spoiled rice, rainwater. Now, for the first time, he felt something refreshing and real. His throat tightened, and tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. He lowered the bottle and turned away, ashamed of his emotion. But the tears came anyway. Soon, more bottles were passed through. The guards watched, smiling quietly. The prisoners began to whisper among themselves. Some laughed softly, awkwardly, as if they had forgotten how to. The sound of bottle caps popping open became the sound of something far greater. An invisible barrier breaking. It was not a treaty, not a surrender, not a victory. It was something more profound, the rediscovery of humanity in the simplest of moments. One of the younger Japanese soldiers looked down at his bottle and whispered, "America no oni janai." The Americans are not demons. He had grown up believing that capture meant torment, that the enemy knew no mercy. But here he was, sipping something that tasted of kindness, handed to him by the very people he was taught to hate. For the Americans, it was just a soda. For the Japanese prisoners, it was proof there was still goodness left in the world. They began to treat the bottles with reverence, washing and reusing them to hold water, Some kept the caps as keepsakes, small tokens of an impossible memory. When one guard asked why they did so, the interpreter explained, "They do not wish to forget this day." In the following weeks, the tone of the camp changed. The once rigid silence was replaced by the occasional murmur of conversation, laughter even. The guards noticed prisoners humming quietly while working in the gardens or cleaning their quarters. The Americans provided newspapers, sports equipment, even art supplies. The Japanese began drawing scenes of nature, mountains, rivers, cherry blossoms, a few sketched bottles of Coca-Cola, labeling them in careful English letters as if to immortalize the object that had changed them. For Richard and the others, it was humbling. They had fought a merciless war, watched friends die on black sand beaches, seen the horrors of battle beyond comprehension. And yet, standing here, they realized victory wasn't about flags or treaties. It was about proving that mercy could survive even in the aftermath of madness. As months passed, word of the Coca-Cola moment spread quietly through the ranks. It became a small legend in the camp, told in hushed tones at night by the prisoners themselves. Some said the drink tasted like peace. Others said it reminded them of youth, of home, of a world they once believed lost forever. Whatever it was, it touched them deeply. Historians may never record the exact date of that moment, nor the names of every man who stood there. But for those who witnessed it, it became one of the defining memories of the post-war years. It was not about a beverage, it was about dignity, about the choice to treat an enemy as a fellow human being when no one demanded it. Years later, when the war was a distant echo, some of those Japanese men returned home. They rebuilt their lives, their families, their nation. And when they spoke of their captivity, they did not speak only of fences and guards. They spoke of a drink called Coca-Cola, shared by their captors under a Pacific sky. They spoke of how one small act of kindness had restored their faith in humanity. And for the Americans who had served there, that day remained with them too. For Richard, it was the day he learned that true victory had nothing to do with domination. It was found in compassion. In the years that followed, when he sat on his porch with a bottle of Coke in hand, he would sometimes close his eyes and see that camp again. The faces of men who had once been enemies, now softened by something as simple as a shared drink. That was the power of Coca-Cola that day, not as a brand, not as a symbol of consumerism, but as a quiet bridge between broken hearts. It was a taste of forgiveness in liquid form, proof that peace can begin with something as small as the sound of a bottle cap hissing open under the sun. When Richard handed the first bottle through the fence, one of the older prisoners hesitated. His hands trembled slightly as he accepted it. The glass felt heavy, unfamiliar. The liquid inside shimmered as if it held something more than just a drink. The man looked at Richard, unsure of what was expected. Richard nodded gently. "Drink," he said. The interpreter repeated the word in Japanese. Slowly, the prisoner lifted it to his lips. The taste hit him with a rush, cold, sweet, alive. It was unlike any taste he had ever known. For years his mouth had only known the bitterness of war. Canned food, spoiled rice, rainwater. Now, for the first time, he felt something refreshing and real. His throat tightened, and tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. He lowered the bottle and turned away, ashamed of his emotion. But the tears came anyway. Soon, more bottles were passed through. The guards watched, smiling quietly. The prisoners began to whisper among themselves. Some laughed softly, awkwardly, as if they had forgotten how to. The sound of bottle caps popping open became the sound of something far greater, an invisible barrier breaking. It was not a treaty, not a surrender, not a victory. It was something more profound, the rediscovery of humanity in the simplest of moments. One of the younger Japanese soldiers looked down at his bottle and whispered, "America no ani ja nai." The Americans are not demons. He had grown up believing that capture meant torment, that the enemy knew no mercy. But here he was, sipping something that tasted of kindness, handed to him by the very people he was taught to hate. For the Americans, it was just a soda. For the Japanese prisoners, it was proof that there was still goodness left in the world. They began to treat the bottles with reverence, washing and reusing them to hold water. Some kept the caps as keepsakes, small tokens of an impossible memory. When one guard asked why they did so, the interpreter explained, "They do not wish to forget this day." In the following weeks, the tone of the camp changed. The once rigid silence was replaced by the occasional murmur of conversation, laughter even. The guards noticed prisoners humming quietly while working in the gardens or cleaning their quarters. The Americans provided newspapers, sports equipment, even art supplies. The Japanese began drawing scenes of nature, mountains, rivers, cherry blossoms. A few sketched bottles of Coca-Cola, labeling them in careful English letters, as if to immortalize the object that had changed them. For Richard and the others, it was humbling. They had fought a merciless war, watched friends die on black sand beaches, seen the horrors of battle beyond comprehension. And yet, standing here, they realized victory wasn't about flags or treaties. It was about proving that mercy could survive even in the aftermath of madness. As months passed, word of the Coca-Cola moment spread quietly through the ranks. It became a small legend in the camp, told in hushed tones at night by the prisoners themselves. Some said the drink tasted like peace. Others said it reminded them of youth, of home, of a world they once believed lost forever. Whatever it was, it touched them deeply. Historians may never record the exact date of that moment, nor the names of every man who stood there. But for those who witnessed it, it became one of the defining memories of the post-war years. It was not about a beverage. It was about dignity, about the choice to treat an enemy as a fellow human being when no one demanded it. Years later, when the war was a distant echo, some of those Japanese men returned home. They rebuilt their lives, their families, their nation. And when they spoke of their captivity, they did not speak only of fences and guards. They spoke of a drink called Coca-Cola, shared by their captors under a Pacific sky. They spoke of how one small act of kindness had restored their faith in humanity. And for the Americans who had served there, that day remained with them too. For Richard, it was the day he learned that true victory had nothing to do with domination. It was found in compassion. In the years that followed, when he sat on his porch with a bottle of Coke in hand, he would sometimes close his eyes and see that camp again. The faces of men who had once been enemies, now softened by something as simple as a shared drink. That was the power of Coca-Cola that day, not as a brand, not as a symbol of consumerism, but as a quiet bridge between broken hearts. It was a taste of forgiveness in liquid form, proof that peace can begin with something as small as the sound of a bottle cap hissing open under the sun. As the first sips of Coca-Cola passed the lips of the Japanese prisoners, a silence fell over the camp, a silence deeper than any that had come before. It wasn't the silence of fear or command. It was the silence of something sacred, something human being rediscovered after years of being buried under hatred, fire, and propaganda. The war had taught both sides to see each other as monsters. And yet, in that single shared moment, a sweetness cut through the bitterness of memory, like sunlight breaking through a storm. One of the older Japanese soldiers, his uniform now faded and tattered, sat on a wooden crate at the edge of the barracks. He had once been an officer, proud and unyielding, the kind of man who had believed that surrender was worse than death. He had led men into battle shouting, "Banzai!" with fire in his heart. But now that same heart felt hollow. When he lifted the bottle to his lips, he expected nothing, just another unfamiliar drink from his captors. But as the cold liquid hit his tongue, something broke inside him. He felt a wave of emotion so sudden, so powerful, that it overwhelmed the discipline drilled into him since youth. His hand began to tremble. His eyes, long hardened by the images of burning cities and dying comrades, blurred with tears he could no longer suppress. He turned his face away, ashamed to be seen crying before his fellow soldiers. But nearby, another man noticed, and then another. Soon others too began to cry quietly, without shame, as if each tear released the pain they had been holding since the war began. The American guards didn't know what to do. They simply stood there, motionless, watching men who had once fought to the death, now reduced to something etchingly human. The guards had been trained to remain professional, to keep distance. But at that moment, distance felt meaningless. They were all soldiers, all tired, all scarred by what they had seen. The Americans had seen their friends fall in jungles and oceans, their bodies buried in foreign soil. The Japanese had seen their homeland burned, their families starved, their emperor forced to surrender. And now here they were, sharing the same sunlight, the same ground, the same moment of unexpected peace. The sound of the ocean carried faintly through the camp, mingling with the occasional hiss of a newly opened bottle. One guard leaned against a fence post, his rifle hanging loosely at his side, and whispered to another, "I never thought I'd see this." His companion nodded slowly. "Guess we're all just men when the fighting stops." The Japanese prisoners sat together in small groups, their voices low, their movements delicate. They handled the bottles with care, as if afraid they might break something precious. A few of them began to speak softly in their own language. Words of disbelief, gratitude, confusion. "Why?" one of them asked through the interpreter. "Why do you give this to us? We were your enemies." The American who had shared the crate smiled faintly and said, "Because the war's over." The interpreter repeated it in Japanese. The men nodded slowly, as if tasting those words as carefully as they had tasted the drink. For some of the younger prisoners, the sweetness of Coca-Cola brought memories they had long buried. Childhood picnics, festivals, the laughter of sisters and brothers before the world had turned into fire. They remembered the first time they had seen an American product in a magazine before the war, the red script of the Coca-Cola logo printed beneath smiling faces. Back then, it was just a foreign curiosity, a symbol of another world. Now, holding it in their hands after all they had endured, it felt like touching that lost world again. Not far from them, an American guard named Thomas Baker watched closely. He was a quiet man, one who rarely spoke unless necessary. He had fought in the Philippines and lost friends there. For months, he had carried resentment in his chest like a stone. But as he watched the prisoners drink, as he saw their tears and their confusion, something inside him began to shift. He realized that these weren't demons. They were men who had been told the same lies from the opposite side. They had fought for pride, for duty, for a country that had promised glory but delivered ashes. He took a deep breath and felt the heaviness inside him begin to lift. Later that day, when the guards gathered for dinner, the conversation turned to what had happened. One of them laughed softly. "Never thought a Coke could make a man cry." Another replied, "Maybe it's not the Coke. Maybe it's the peace." The others nodded. They didn't fully understand the power of what they had witnessed, but they felt it, an invisible current that ran through the camp and changed the air itself. That night, the Japanese prisoners sat around quietly, their bottles empty, the glass catching the last reflections of the fading sun. One of them, a young man who had once been a pilot, took the cap from his bottle and slipped it into his pocket. It would become his most treasured possession. He didn't know why exactly, only that it represented something pure, something that reminded him the world was not entirely lost. He thought of his mother, of how she used to tell him that kindness could exist even in war, that someday he might see it for himself. He whispered her name into the wind. In the days that followed, the Americans continued their routine: inspections, meal distributions, medical checks. But the relationship between guards and prisoners had changed subtly. There was no friendship, not yet, but there was recognition. A few guards began greeting the prisoners with nods instead of orders. A few prisoners, once rigid and silent, now bowed deeply in return. Some of the Americans started leaving extra portions of fruit or bread on the tables. Small gestures unnoticed by most, yet powerful enough to bridge the unspoken distance between them. For the Japanese soldiers, every act of kindness was both a comfort and a challenge. They had been taught their entire lives that to be defeated was to be disgraced, that the enemy would show no mercy. Yet here they were, treated not as beasts, but as men. The contradiction tore at them. Some wept at night, silently, unable to reconcile the two worlds. Others began to write, sketching on scraps of paper provided by the guards, sketches of mountains, cherry blossoms, bottles, and even the American flag. The guards sometimes found these drawings and kept them, quietly moved by the detail and care. One afternoon, an elderly prisoner approached the fence as an American guard passed by. He bowed deeply and held out a small wooden carving he had made from scrap. It was of a bottle, slender, imperfect, but instantly recognizable. The guard stared, unsure what to say. The interpreter explained that it was a gift, a gesture of thanks. The American hesitated, then took it gently, bowing slightly in return. In that gesture, simple, wordless, the story of forgiveness was told without a single sentence. The guards didn't know that many of the prisoners had cried again that night, not out of sadness, but out of something they hadn't felt in years' relief. The war had taken everything from them, their homes, their brothers, their purpose. But it hadn't taken their souls. The kindness of their captors had reminded them that life still held meaning. That redemption wasn't just a word for the victors. In the weeks that followed, the Americans occasionally shared small luxuries whenever supplies allowed: soap, canned fruit, sometimes even cigarettes. But none of those gestures struck as deep as that first moment with Coca-Cola. That was the one they talked about, quietly, reverently. It became something of a legend among them. Whenever a new shipment arrived, and the faint sound of clinking bottles echoed through the camp, a murmur would spread: "The drink of peace has come again." Historians who later studied the Pacific War often spoke of treaties, battles, and politics. But no textbook ever captured the soul of that moment, when soldiers from opposite sides of the world found understanding not through negotiations, but through the simple act of sharing a drink. It wasn't the drink itself that mattered. It was what it represented, an acknowledgement that no matter how deep the hatred, compassion could still bloom in the ruins of war. Years later, when those same Japanese men returned home, they told their children about it. It was cold, they would say, cold and sweet, like something from a dream. They spoke not of their defeat, but of their humanity. Some of them even kept the bottle caps as relics, passing them down to their families as proof that kindness could exist even in captivity. And across the ocean, the American guards carried their own memories. The sight of proud, stoic men moved to tears by a single gesture. Time would eventually bury the faces of those men beneath history's dust. But the story lived on, whispered in barracks and veteran halls, shared over the very drink that had brought them together. In that moment of sweetness amid bitterness, something far greater than victory or surrender took place. It was the quiet reconciliation of two broken nations, distilled into a single shared experience. And though no monument was ever built to commemorate it, no document ever recorded it, the men who lived it knew. Peace can begin with something as simple as a bottle, as small as a smile, and as human as the act of sharing. In the days after that first shared drink, the air in the camp seemed to change. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but something had softened. The stiffness in the posture of the guards, the cold stillness of the prisoners, even the silence that once hung like a heavy curtain between them. All of it began to shift. It was as if the act of sharing Coca-Cola had unlocked something invisible in both sides. For the Japanese prisoners, it was the first time they felt treated as men rather than as conquered enemies. For the Americans, it was the first time they saw those same men not as faceless soldiers from a propaganda poster, but as human beings caught in the same tragedy of war. The prisoners began to move differently. They walked with purpose, no longer dragging their feet or staring blankly at the dirt. Each morning, as the sun rose over the camp, they formed quiet lines to receive their rations, bowing slightly as they were handed food. The Americans responded not with orders, but with nods. The atmosphere, once heavy with fear and shame, now carried the faint hum of life returning. There were still fences, still guards with rifles, but the hostility had faded into something closer to mutual respect. One morning, a group of prisoners approached the American officer in charge and asked through the interpreter if they could plant a garden. The request surprised him. When asked why, one prisoner replied simply, "We wish to make something grow." The officer paused, then nodded. The next day they were given tools, shovels, hose, and a patch of dry earth near the barracks. The prisoners worked from sunrise to dusk, their hands blistered but their spirits alive. Slowly, small patches of green began to appear, rows of vegetables, flowers, even a few saplings. It wasn't just a garden. It was an act of healing. The Americans often stopped to watch them. Some would hand over seeds or leftover food scraps that could be composted. The prisoners, in turn, would bow and smile faintly, gestures that had once seemed impossible in the early days of captivity. The camp, once a place of despair, began to look like something closer to a village, alive, cooperative, and strangely peaceful. Among the prisoners was a young man named Hiroshi. Before the war, he had been an artist, a painter who loved landscapes and scenes of daily life. The war had taken his brushes, his canvases, and nearly his spirit. But one afternoon, an American guard noticed him sketching in the dirt with a stick, delicate lines forming the outline of a tree. The guard returned later with a small notepad and a pencil. "For you," he said simply. Hiroshi accepted it with trembling hands. That night, by the dim light of the camp lantern, he drew the first thing that came to mind, a bottle of Coca-Cola sitting on a wooden table. The label, the curves of the glass, the shimmer of light. He captured it all with such care that even the other prisoners gathered quietly to watch. The Americans who saw the sketch were moved. To them, it wasn't just a drawing. It was a reflection of something greater, a shared memory that belonged to everyone in that camp. Hiroshi continued to draw in the weeks that followed. He sketched the guards, the gardens, the prisoners smiling for the first time in years. Each page became a record of transformation, proof that even in captivity, beauty could survive. At night, the prisoners sometimes gathered near the fence, speaking softly about their families. They would describe the faces of their wives, the laughter of their children, the cherry blossoms that lined their hometown streets in spring. The Americans, sitting just beyond the fence, often listened in silence. They didn't understand the language, but they understood the emotion. One night, a guard reached into his pocket and pulled out a harmonica. Without saying a word, he began to play, a slow, soulful tune that drifted through the camp like smoke. The Japanese listened quietly, some closing their eyes. When he finished, one of them clapped softly, and soon the rest joined in. That night, something changed forever. Music had crossed the wire, and in doing so erased it. As the weeks went by, the camp became known among other American units as the Peace Camp. Visitors would remark on how well kept it was, how the prisoners seemed almost content. Of course, no one was truly happy to be there, but something rare had bloomed between captors and captives' mutual humanity. The Americans treated the prisoners with fairness and dignity, and the prisoners repaid the trust with discipline and cooperation. It was during one of those quiet afternoons that the letters began to appear. The prisoners, using scraps of paper and ink provided by the guards, began writing notes, some addressed to their families, others to the Americans themselves. One letter, written in careful English, read, "We believed you would hate us. We believed you would destroy us, but you have shown mercy. We thank you not as prisoners, but as men." The guard who received that letter kept it folded in his pocket for years after the war ended. Not all of the prisoners could write in English. So many of them expressed their gratitude through action. They helped repair fences that storms had damaged. They swept the grounds. They even built small wooden benches for the guards. When the Americans tried to refuse, saying it wasn't necessary, the prisoners insisted. "It is our honor," the interpreter explained. "We wish to build something good." Each day began to feel less like captivity and more like coexistence. The Americans noticed that fights, once common among the prisoners, had nearly disappeared. The Japanese began looking after each other, sharing food, checking on the sick, teaching one another simple English phrases. Words like "thank you" and "friend" began to echo across the camp. And always, somewhere in the background, bottles of Coca-Cola could be seen, empty now, yet never discarded. Some prisoners had polished the glass until it gleamed, setting the bottles on windowsills to catch the morning light. Others used them as vases, placing wildflowers inside. For many of them, that first sip of Coke had become a symbol of rebirth. It was as though the sweetness of the drink had awakened something long dormant. The desire to live, to rebuild, to forgive. They began to look forward to each day, not as another step toward the unknown, but as another chance to restore their humanity. When the war trials began elsewhere and darker stories surfaced from other camps across the world, this one remained a quiet exception, a testament to what could happen when compassion guided men instead of vengeance. The American officer in charge received commendations not for military discipline, but for moral leadership. When asked later how he managed to maintain peace, he smiled and said, "We gave them hope. Sometimes that's all a man needs." By the end of 1946, orders came to begin repatriation. The prisoners would finally return home. As word spread through the camp, emotions ran high. Some wept openly, torn between the joy of returning to Japan and the sorrow of leaving behind the place that had unexpectedly given them peace. The Americans prepared supplies for their journey, food, clothing, and small tokens. But the prisoners had prepared something as well. On the morning of their departure, they gathered near the gate and presented the guards with gifts. Handcrafted carvings, sketches, and folded letters written in careful, practiced English. One of those letters read, "When we drank your Coca-Cola, we tasted not just a drink, but kindness. We will remember that kindness forever." When the trucks finally arrived to take them to the port, the prisoners stood in neat rows and bowed deeply, some with tears streaming down their faces. The Americans saluted in return. No words were spoken, for none were needed. The moment spoke for itself, one of the rare instances in history when former enemies parted as something close to friends. Years later, when Japan had rebuilt from the ashes and the world had moved on, a few of those men found themselves standing in front of small shops in Tokyo, watching young children drink Coca-Cola from glass bottles. Some of them smiled quietly, remembering that day in the Pacific when they first tasted it, when their tears had mixed with the fizzing sweetness of peace. For them, that moment was not about America or Japan, victory or defeat. It was about humanity's capacity to change, to rise above the past and recognize itself in the eyes of another. That memory, fragile but enduring, became a quiet cornerstone in the rebuilding of their souls. And somewhere, perhaps in Kansas or California, one of the American guards might have been doing the same. Sitting on his porch years later, the sun warm on his face, a cold bottle of Coke in his hand, thinking of men who had once been enemies, and of the extraordinary day when war's bitterness gave way to something sweeter. It was never about the drink alone. It was about what it represented. A gesture so small it might have been forgotten, yet powerful enough to echo through lifetimes. In that camp, surrounded by barbed wire and scars of war, the act of sharing Coca-Cola had done what no weapon ever could. It had made peace tangible, visible, drinkable. And so, as the world moved forward, the story lived on, an unspoken reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are not won on battlefields, but in moments of compassion shared between strangers.